Being recorded.
House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length and limitations of the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you've finished speaking. Consistent with House Res 965 and the accompanying regulation, staff will only mute members and witnesses when it's appropriate and they're not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating background noise. I see that we have a quorum present, and I'll now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we're holding a hearing today entitled Reaffirming the Good Friday Agreement. I can't recall one instance meeting with Irish officials when the sincere gratitude for what they termed was the indispensable U.S. involvement in the Good Friday Agreement wasn't expressed. That's why a year and a half ago, I held a meeting before the subcommittee on the implications of Brexit for Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, as well as possible paths forward in implementing the Northern Ireland Protocol. As we all know, the Northern Ireland Protocol was a key point of controversy within Brexit. This protocol was established in order to ensure that the United Kingdom could exit the European Union's common market without creating a quote-unquote hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. With Brexit now behind us, we're seeing the impacts of the withdrawal play out at shipping ports, in unstocked supermarkets, on the streets of Northern Ireland. The complicated components of the withdrawal agreement, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and underlying economic instability of the region have converged to create a very difficult environment. Unfortunately, in the last few weeks, we've also seen a resurgence of violence across Northern Ireland involving young people 12 years of age, born more than a decade after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. While this violence may have been sparked in the process of implementing the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's truly rooted in historic divisions. After a period of relative stability and positive direction following years of peace-building efforts, this recent violence stopped many of us in our tracks, myself included. This is because clashes between groups in Northern Ireland have been incredibly dangerous in the past. Northern Ireland has already mourned the loss of more than 3,500 lives, many of whom were civilians during the violence and chaos commonly known as the Troubles. While recent violence has slowed, it's also reminded us that peace in Europe is not something to be taken for granted. It's a status of life that we constantly work towards and build upon. For this reason, I've called this hearing to reflect on and reaffirm the Good Friday Agreement and better understand the underlying tensions and the current situation on the ground. The Good Friday Agreement was signed 23 years ago on April 10th, 1998. To come to this agreement, representatives and activists in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom came together to discuss paths forward. The United States played a key role with former U.S. Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell chairing the negotiations. Since then, many of us here in Congress, led by Chairman Richie Neal, have continued to support the progress that's been made under this agreement. Now, in the face of renewed violence, I've called this hearing and invited founding members of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, a group who played integral roles in the Good Friday Agreement negotiations and have continued to be at the forefront advocating for representation and dealing with the past. The Northern Ireland Women's Coalition was established in 1996 to ensure representation of women at the Good Friday Agreement negotiations. These women were bound by a common vision, as well as values of inclusion, equality, and human rights. After just a few weeks of incredibly intense political organizing, the coalition was successful in sending 2 delegates, including hearing witness Monica McWilliams, to the negotiations. Incorporating both Catholic and Protestant voices, their efforts ensured representation and community engagement in many countries, and including our own. As we look forward and we look at the strife around the world today, I join many people in pointing to the peace agreement as a means of hope, as a beacon for potential peace throughout the world. As the landmark Women, Peace, and Security Resolution 1325 underscores, when women are involved in peace negotiation, agreements have been proven to be more effective and last longer. And the Good Friday Agreement is no exception to this. Through the inclusion of diverse voices during the peace-building process, and thanks to the courageous and vital work of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and especially the founding members here with us today, the agreement is stronger and more comprehensive and still serves as a bedrock for peace in Northern Ireland. We hold this hearing today because of the integral role of the U.S. in the Good Friday Agreement, because it's a U.S. priority, and because we must not just deal with the troubles of today, but also deal with the issues of full implementation going forward. With that said, we'll hold this hearing to allow us to better understand the process, the long-standing implications of the Good Friday Agreement in the present day. With that, I'm going to recognize for his opening statement, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Keating. Thank you to our esteemed witnesses today who were instrumental in ushering peace and stability in Northern Ireland. The United States remains committed to supporting the hard-won progress made in Northern Ireland since the Good Friday Agreement and helping Belfast achieve a prosperous and lasting peace. Ireland and Northern Ireland hold a dear place for me and the people of Pennsylvania that I represent, and I know the people that everyone in our committee represents. For me personally, my grandfather migrated from the border region. My father helped found the Irish American Cultural Society in my hometown. The Good Friday Agreement, forged in part by individuals in this room, is one of the greatest diplomatic success stories of the 20th century. Violence de-escalated, trade and tourism swelled, and the people of Northern Ireland from different communities sought out a path to a future that would bring lasting peace. The agreement called for the signers to affirm their commitment to the mutual respect, civil rights, and religious liberties of everyone in the community. Just as the United States was present to facilitate the negotiations that achieved the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the U.S. government must continue to push for the agreement's full implementation and the consolidation for peace. Former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell's role in brokering the peace talks established a strong example of what U.S. support and interest can achieve. Toward that end, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the United States can best support efforts in Northern Ireland to foster peace and reconciliation. I'm thrilled that we will hear today from the Honorable Mitchell Reiss, who I hope can expand on the importance of the United States appointing a special envoy to Northern Ireland, a role he once held. Moreover, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses on the remaining threats to peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. I hope that they will address the drivers of the recent riots and violence that erupted in Northern Ireland earlier this year. It is especially important to understand that to what degree unionist discontent with the new post-Brexit arrangements drove the violence when compared to other factors, including frustrations caused by COVID-19 lockdowns and poor socioeconomic conditions. The United States and the U.S. Congress must remain committed to sustaining the peace process and generating cross-community engagement and economic opportunity in Northern Ireland. Moreover, we must work with the UK government, the Irish government, and the EU to ensure the trade frictions resulting from the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol are resolved, and that all communities in Northern Ireland can reap the economic benefits of the peace dividend. I also hope our witnesses will address the enduring threat of parliamentarianism and how the United States can support efforts to disarm and disband these organizations. We are fortunate today to have two members of the Independent Reporting Commission, which was established to address parliamentarianism in Northern Ireland, to provide their insights on how to eradicate this threat that imperils the legacy of the Good Friday Agreement. We are experiencing a highly polarizing time on Capitol Hill. There are many things that divide our friends across the aisle, from all of us. But when it comes to a commitment to peace to Northern Ireland, members of both parties can stand completely united. It is my hope today that Congress can learn from our witnesses and how the United States can continue to support the implementation of their peacemaking strategies moving forward. Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling the hearing today for an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Look forward to the discussion, and I yield back.
You're muted, sir.
The ranking member for his comments, and also for the bipartisan spirit he demonstrated in those, and to really send a signal to everyone that on the issue of Ireland, that we are together across the aisle. And I'd also like to thank all our witnesses for joining us today. As founding members of the coalition, you've been on the ground since the days of the negotiations and have continued to be the forefront of transitional justice, disbanding paramilitary groups and integrating education and representation into the political structure that's there today. Your testimony will help us better understand the longstanding impacts of the Good Friday Agreement and how we can move beyond Brexit and beyond the pandemic to ensure stability that lasts for generations to come. As members of Congress, we continue to support the work you have set out to do, ensuring inclusion, equality, and human rights in Northern Ireland. Professor Monica McWilliams is an Emeritus Professor at Ulster's University Transitional Justice Innovation and Commissioner for the Independent Reporting Commission. She's a former Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, former member of the Legislative Assembly of Northern Ireland, co-founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and a signatory to the Good Friday Agreement. Ms. Jane Morrice is a member of the Board of Governors at the Integrated Educational Fund. She's a Deputy Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, former head of the European Commission Office in Northern Ireland, and co-founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. Ambassador Mitchell Reiss is a commissioner for the Independent Reporting Commission. He's also a former United States Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. I'll now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each. And if I could, I'd like to ask unanimous consent because Mr. Series, as a chairman, will be leaving. If I have unanimous consent, I'd like to recognize him for a brief statement before he has to leave with his duties as chair of Western Hemisphere. Mr. Series, do you have, without objection, any introductory comments?
Well, thank you very much. But what I wanted to say is my first trip, or one of the first trips I ever took from becoming a congressman was to Northern Ireland. And for me, being Cuban, when I got there, the whole thing was really an eye-opener for me. One of the things that is most vivid to me is when we got there, they put us in a bus and took us across this bridge where they had made a temporary basketball court. And I saw kids, both Protestants and Catholics, playing. And as we got around talking to the kids, no sooner did we get there, 20 minutes later, the bus driver came over and put us back in the bus and said, look, we have to leave. I said, we just got here. Why? He says, well, because at 8 o'clock, they closed the bridge. And we had to get back to the other side. So that to me was like really moving in a sense that there was still so much division. And my concern now is, do we have anybody that took the steps that Bill Clinton took or Mitchell took to try to tamper down the violence of what's going on there now? And obviously, I have a lot of concern what Brexit is going to do to this peace that was so long in coming that was worked out. So that's what I wanted to say. You know, I'm sorry I have to leave, but you know.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Series, and thanks for your perspective. And it's one more lesson and one more example, given your work as Chairman Western Hemisphere, how the example of peace in Northern Ireland still gives hope to so many other parts of the world. Thank you. I'll now recognize the witnesses for 5 minutes each, and without objection, your prepared written statement will be made part of the record. Professor McWilliams, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm delighted to participate in this hearing today. As you've just heard, I was a signatory to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and it has not only saved lives over the past 23 years, but it was the basis for us to build future stability on the island of Ireland, north and south, and to build strong relationships between us in Northern Ireland, the south of Ireland, and the UK, as well as making our connections with the rest of Europe. And it has been an example, a good model of conflict resolution for the rest of the world. And I'd like to put on record here today my acknowledgement of the consistent expressions of support for the Good Friday Agreement by US political leaders and you yourselves today from across the political aisle, and the attention constantly and consistently paid to the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the new trade and cooperation agreement resulting from Brexit. The next 4 years could prove to be quite difficult and contentious times for us. This year we have the centenary of the partition of Ireland. We also have the 50th anniversary of internment without trial this year, the 40th anniversary of the Republican hunger strikes this year, the Assembly elections next year at the very latest, and indeed there is the protocol coming in 2024, and the census will be published shortly, which may also determine the demands for a referendum to be held. That referendum was indeed part of the agreement. So all of that is lying ahead of us. And this is potentially a perfect storm that needs judicious and careful handling and the continuous interest of you in the United States. First, let me turn to the issue of protecting rights and equality. Many civic society groups and organisations are very concerned at the impact that Brexit is now having on the protection of the rights and equality provisions that were in the Good Friday Agreement, and particularly the interest that the European Union had in protecting those rights and the legislation that was included as part of us being in the European Union. It's little wonder now that we have these concerns, particularly that no breaches of human rights and equality should occur, as they were contributory factors to the long-running conflict that I lived through. And so it's really important that we continue to ensure that Brexit does not affect this, that the current review of the Human Rights Act that is currently being undertaken by the UK government does not affect this, nor indeed the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that has indeed weakened some labour rights and environmental rights and have raised those concerns. So the Bill of Rights that was promised in the Good Friday Agreement is still outstanding. As Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission, over 13 years ago, I presented that advice with my fellow commissioners to the UK government, and there it sits on 10 Downing Street ever since. Now, as a result of the recent negotiations between the parties, they agreed that there should be a Bill of Rights committee established at the Assembly. And it is good to see all those parties now sitting around the table discussing this much needed issue in terms of the future provisions of human rights and equality. But the agreement did not ask me nor my fellow commissioners to find consensus before we presented that advice on the Bill of Rights. And that remains a continuous concern, that there may not be consensus found at the local level in Northern Ireland, but the UK government still needs to hold up its promise to legislate on a Bill of Rights, particularly at a time that we are now leaving Europe and given the context of Brexit. So that is the first point that I would like to make. The second is in relation to the issue of inclusion. The Women's Coalition stood on 3 principles: equality, human rights, and inclusion. And today, and back then it was mostly political inclusion, but today we are concerned about the issues of economic and social inclusion, and perhaps indeed The recent disturbances on the street reflect some of that, in that many people, particularly in the Loyalist and Unionist community, perceive themselves to have been left behind. And I do think that these perceptions sometimes can become reality. And therefore, we need a much clearer analysis of the potential positive opportunities that remaining in the single market holds for people who feel that their communities have lost out on investment in jobs and training and education. It is also good to see, however, the amount of good work that has been invested at the interface levels, at the hotspots, in the disadvantaged areas, by youth workers, by community leaders and civic leaders. And I observed it myself over the recent month. And I pay tribute here to the International Fund for Ireland that invested so much in making sure that that dividend of work in community development paid off, and indeed it did. And I was also pleased to see the church leaders standing together at the interface, showing their solidarity across the religious denominations at a time when it was most needed and at the height of those disturbances. That is all good for peace. And as we know, peace building involves communication, and it involves the building of trust. And also there is an initiative called Politics in Action in Schools. And today, these young people across Northern Ireland will be watching this particular hearing and taking an avid interest in the United States' interest and members of Congress's interest in Northern Ireland. All these initiatives with young people are much needed. And indeed, one of the concerns recently has been that the programs for young people during the summer are closed. And we continue to need diversionary programs to be invested in. And therein lies the good funds of the International Fund for Ireland. And one of the concerns, of course, recently was this issue of using social media to gather young people quickly into a riot situation. And so to prevent them from going to prison or from prosecutions at such a young age, we need to pay careful attention to how we can prevent social media being used in this way. And indeed, many fake accounts that were opened to just simply call people out onto the streets. There is a serious issue in relation to identity. And again, it also needs attention. And I address that issue in my statement. And I finally want to bring attention to some of the points that are still outstanding. The issue of the legacy. There was an agreement called the Stormont House Agreement. And I am aware that my colleague Mitchell Reiss will pay more attention to that. But there is an urgent need for the UK government not to work on a unilateral basis, but to consult and to stop the delay in addressing the needs of victims, which I have to say the Women's Coalition actually put a proposal into the peace agreement, because in any conflict situation, the needs of victims must also be addressed. I'm involved in Operation Canova's governance board, and I have to say it's an excellent example of how investigations can be carried out with legitimacy and with human rights compliance. There were some concerns over how policing in the community may have reverted in recent years. I'm very happy to say that the policing board consists of both politicians and lay members, independent lay members, is a model for policing. And it stayed in place, and its oversight was much valued during the recent months. And finally, the mixed messages that have come from particularly the UK government on Brexit must stop. There are potential positives in this for Northern Ireland, but they have been undermined by those very mixed and occasionally very negative messages. Finally, the Civic Forum. Civic dialogue in Northern Ireland has proved essential to peace building, and it is much needed. The Civic Forum was stood down. There should be continuous district council forums established. The reinsertion of the Civic Forum, as promised in the agreement, should now be implemented. So I would ask that the continuous involvement and interest from the US Congress be maintained in the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, particularly in relation to issues of the Bill of Rights and the legacy, and also in relation to any expertise or support that you may give us in relation to that work with young people, and particularly around how badly social media can be used. And lastly, I would strongly urge the appointment of a US envoy. who proved in the past to be absolutely crucial and key to helping us with our peace process. And given the special circumstances now arising from Brexit, this is a person who is much needed in terms of maintaining the contact on social and economic policies between Brussels, London, Dublin, Belfast, and Washington, DC. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in the hearing today.
Professor, thank you very much for your comments as a signatory and someone that will give us a perspective, intergenerational perspective going forward. I now turn to Ms. Morrice, and you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Can I begin by saying thank you, America, for your dedicated commitment to the Good Friday Agreement. I want to start by setting out my stall. I was born in Belfast. I was a teenager when the Troubles started, and I've been working for peace and stability for decades, particularly through the work of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. I can say that the day of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement was the greatest day in my professional life. The day of the Brexit referendum was, without question, the worst. So if you don't mind, I want to focus on that subject because that is my area of expertise and experience. Since Brexit, I've become a relatively rare breed in my country. I'm a strong supporter of the European Union, and I'm from a unionist community background. That's why I call myself a European unionist. Constructive ambiguity, I think that's called. I've been opposed to Brexit since the outset because I firmly believe that the European Union membership enabled peace in Northern Ireland to happen. And of course, the role of America was and still is vital. But if we're talking at the grassroots of bringing communities together, the European Union peace program was vital to that end. Saying that, I'm actually willing to accept the protocol as the best of a bad Brexit deal. The problem, obviously, is that the majority of unionists don't think likewise. But I'm a firm believer, as Monica well knows, in constructive, creative compromise. And I'm going to put 4 proposals to the committee. The first is regarding the protocol. It's to lobby for the extension of the protocol to Scotland. This seems to be a very simple idea to a complex problem. It would mean most of the customs checks would move from the Irish sea border to the Scottish border with England. Bringing Scotland into the equation would put paid to the unionist loyalist argument that Northern Ireland's been cut adrift from the rest of the UK and their British identity has been diluted. Of course, a lot will depend on the outcome of the Scottish elections tomorrow, but this new, what I'm calling Celtic Protocol, could serve as a starting point for an association of Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland working together in the EU single market customs union, similar to the Benelux countries, which were actually the founding members of the European Union. My second proposal is, Monica's mentioned it, for the reinstatement of the Civic Forum. Now, that is a commitment under the Good Friday Agreement that we in the Women's Coalition got in there. And it's vital that that be reinstated. When I say that, I would appreciate American lobbying for that. The Irish Citizens Assembly have had tremendous success preparing for a referendum on social issues, but political unionism isn't prepared to take part in all Ireland civic discussions. So I think they wouldn't refuse if the Civic Forum was doing that. Third is the need for greater engagement with the south of Ireland, in the south of Ireland with the unionist community in the north. The Irish decision to keep Erasmus and the European Health Card is a great step forward. But there needs to be more communication on this subject. For example, the availability of someone who wants a hip replacement takes 3 years waiting list in the north, where they can get it in 3 months in the south, and it can be reimbursed by the British National Health Service. People need to know about that. Student exchange also, Erasmus north-south would be a very good idea. My final point and this is one referring specifically to yourselves, is for greater cooperation between the United States and the European Union to promote reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Now, during the peace process, the US took a top-down approach involving presidents, the Clintons in particular, in an exceptional effort to bring people together. The role of Senator George Mitchell and the Clintons and the White House St. Patrick's Day events are but a few examples of US diplomacy and political power at its best. The EU approach, as I said, was bottom-up. Through its multi-million-pound peace programme, it funds the coming together of grassroots organisations on a cross-community and cross-border basis. And, interesting to note, they have agreed to continue this programme beyond Brexit. So, in concluding, I want to dwell on that final point in a little more detail. The Good Friday Agreement brought peace and an end to sectarian violence on our streets, but genuine reconciliation is still a very long way off. That's the area we need to focus on. The peace walls, which still separate Catholic and Protestant communities, are the most visible example of segregation at its worst. If the EU and the US would work together to set up a specific us and you, nice name, reconciliation fund to promote community reconciliation, and there I would focus on something like integrated education, because that I firmly believe, and there are many of us who do, is an important area for young people to rub shoulders together and learn from each other and each other's cultures. Integrated education is the way forward, but also mixed housing, support for victims, shared understanding, and of course, one of the big roles for yourselves is investment in what could be a peaceful, prosperous, brilliant Northern Ireland. So, if they say that it takes 30 years, if it takes 30 years to make war, it takes the same time, 30 years to make peace. And if that's the case, at the 30th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in 2028, Northern Ireland could really become one of the greatest examples of real conflict resolution in the world, and a place where everyone wants to do business because it'll be open to the world. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Morrice. And I'll now turn to our final witness, Ambassador Reiss. Thank you for your past service, and you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, for inviting me to testify today. Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol have caused great anxiety over Northern Ireland's constitutional, political, and economic future. For many Protestants in the North, they have also raised fundamental questions over their future status and identity. However, even if Northern Ireland's status after Brexit is settled, there are three persistent challenges that will continue to impact its future: paramilitarism, group transition, and legacy issues. Paramilitarism in all its forms is a threat to the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement, whether your goal is a united Ireland or the preservation of civil societies and the rule of law in both the North and the South. An estimated 17,000 members belong to so-called loyalist paramilitary organizations alone. To provide some perspective, the equivalent number in the United States would be almost 3 million paramilitary members. A purely law and order approach cannot end paramilitarism. You can't simply arrest your way out of this problem. This approach must be balanced with one that addresses socioeconomic deprivation in those communities where the paramilitaries operate and exert coercive control. These communities suffer from educational underattainment, unemployment, poverty, a lack of investment, mental health issues, and drug addiction. Data show there is a direct correlation between paramilitarism and this type of deprivation. The political leaders in Northern Ireland need to own a comprehensive approach, meaning they have to provide the appropriate resources, closely supervise the relevant government bodies to ensure implementation, and to be accountable for its success. A second related issue is how to engage with those paramilitaries that want to transition to a different nonviolent form. There currently is no formal process that allows key stakeholders to have a seat at the table and ensure that their voices are heard. In the past, London has been more focused on other issues, and political and community leaders in Northern Ireland have been reluctant to engage with alleged criminals and convicted felons for fear of public criticism and the political risks involved. Such a process is urgently needed because the paramilitaries will not disappear on their own. They are not capable of self-transitioning. Further, time is not on our side. The situation is likely to get worse before it gets better. And group transition is closely intertwined with the UK's efforts to address and resolve a related issue, the legacy cases deriving from the Troubles. As Professor McWilliams mentioned earlier, the Stormont House Agreement in December 2014 established certain principles and structures to deal with the legacy of the past. This legacy process involves three elements. First is an oral history archive, which serves as a repository of the experiences from the Troubles. Second is an historical investigations unit, which investigates Troubles-related deaths and may refer cases for criminal prosecution. And third, the Independent Commission on Information Retrieval, which enables victims and other survivors to confidentially receive information the Independent Commission has acquired about the Troubles-related deaths of their relatives. Any information acquired by the Independent Commission will not be disclosed to law enforcement or intelligence agencies and will be inadmissible in criminal and civil proceedings. There currently is no consensus in Northern Ireland among the political parties or the more than 4 dozen victims groups as to how these legacy bodies should function. One reason is because it's unclear whether information about past criminality provided to the Historical Investigations Unit will take precedence over information provided to the Independent Commission with respect to possible criminal prosecutions. This resulting uncertainty deters paramilitary members from engaging with any of the legacy bodies or participating in any type of transition process for fear of criminally implicating themselves. Finally, I want to endorse the appointment of a special envoy for Northern Ireland. I believe, like my 2 fellow testimonies today, I believe the United States can once more play a crucial role in helping the people in the North. The United States brings a long track record of proven diplomatic success and has the ability to help the political parties and leaders in London and Dublin with the challenges that I've mentioned above. Once again, thank you for inviting me to testify today and for your time. I'd welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ambassador. I thank all of our witnesses for their testimony. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to House rules. All time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know. We'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank our witnesses, and if you could, I think Ms. Morrice has already touched on specifics as the ambassador too, and as well as to an extent Professor McWilliams. But can you talk to the American public now and tell them how important U.S. involvement is in these negotiations, and specifically how, besides the suggestions in your opening statements, U.S. involvement can be crucial, not just in dealing with the more recent, overflow of Brexit issues, but also in the long-standing commitment that's not quite yet met. So, if you could, I'll let anyone jump in that they want to, but if you can, here's your chance to talk to the American public as well.
Thank you, Chair. I will briefly just address that in that through my own experience of having Senator Mitchell involved in our peace negotiations, but also going to the United States all those years on regular basis and speaking to Congress members, it was incredible how much that was valued back home. But it was also incredible that each time we started putting forward proposals, we asked, how could the US help us with this? Who should we talk to in the US in relation to this? And that paid off. And for that reason, both the Irish government and the UK government and the Northern Ireland government all look to the US as friends, as good friends that have helped them to build the stability along the way. And in relation to the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, I think this is crucial in that the US government should make it clear that it expects to see the adherence to these standards in terms of labour rights and social protections and environmental standards. We've come a long way, and I myself know that as a woman who didn't have any of those rights until the European Union came in relation to sex discrimination, equal pay, and many other rights. We would not have got those had the European directives not pushed the UK government in that direction, and hence the flow over to Northern Ireland. The same applies now. We cannot afford to cut back on the rights that are in place. We need to maintain them and sustain them. But likewise, there is a concern that without the oversight from the US, that could potentially happen. And that certainly would be a step backwards. And the other point that I think is really important, and I made it, was that if there were to be a US envoy, then there would be a contact, a regular contact, in relation to this concern about whether or not this protocol is positive or not. Because it seems to be a tennis match going on between the two governments. And that we cannot afford that, lobbying the ball back and forwards. That's feeding into the negativity in the community. And these young loyalists who are taken to the streets, believing there's nothing in it for them. And so it's that third party person with gravitas, with integrity, with honesty, who has acted in that role in the past. When that voice speaks up, people listen. And I think that on the European positive messages at the moment that are turned into such negative ones, and to show that if there's technical problems, they can be fixed. And that these are not big political constitutional issues that they've turned into be. And that those negotiations with the EU, where there needs to be more slack, where it doesn't have to be so problematic, I think that is also where you bring the experience from the US in terms of your trade negotiations. And that would be much valued. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a little over a minute of my time left. Does anyone else want to suggest that?
I would like,
Ms.
may I
Morrice?
come in quickly? Because I think what is, to talk to the American people, I think it's very important. Irish America is well known, but don't forget your Ulster Scots roots. President Clinton said it himself, of the 40 million Irish Americans, half are of Protestant stock. The Ulster Scots, I understand that there's more than a dozen American presidents were Ulster Scots. And so there's a brilliant musical called On Eagle's Wing, which could be bigger than Riverdance, promoting the Ulster Scots legacy and really lifting up that culture and putting it on the same level. So making Irish America, Ulster Scots is America as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, do
yes.
I have time for a moment?
Yeah,
So
briefly, yes.
Very briefly. So the United States is the most optimistic country in the world. We're positive, we're forward-looking. I think that sense of optimism is needed in many places, and certainly in Northern Ireland. And I think that's the role the United States has played in the past, where we do bring a sense of possibility to the conversations. The UK and Ireland are our friends and allies. It's possible to say things to them in private that they need to hear and still have credibility. So I think it's the public ability to be positive and encouraging, the private ability to tell important messages to the two capitals. And I think also Irish America, many individuals have played important roles as private citizens. And I think all of those can be energized and organized by a special envoy. And that's why I endorse the Biden administration's appointing one.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank our witnesses. Now I'd like to call on Representative Pfluger for 5 minutes of questioning. Representative Pfluger?
Yes, can you hear me? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Yes, I can. Thank
And
you.
I appreciate the opportunity on this hearing. Thank you for the leadership. To all the witnesses on the panel, thank you for your commentary and this important discussion. I wanted to ask Ambassador Reiss, you mentioned in the written testimony that an all-government approach to address the paramilitarism issue in Northern Ireland must incorporate not only a law and order strand, but also a socioeconomic piece to it. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the latter, and then maybe address how the United States can help address the socioeconomic drivers of the paramilitarism activity and what we can do.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'd also like to invite my colleague, Professor Williams, to jump in as well on this. There are multiple reasons why these communities are failing. And I mentioned some of them: educational underattainment, lack of jobs, an opportunity to make easy money selling drugs, mental health issues. These are areas where Protestant paramilitaries, in many cases, most cases, these are criminal gangs that are just preying on vulnerable families and young people. The British government needs to do a better job of comprehensively addressing this issue, in my view, and assigning somebody who wakes up every morning and that's the first thing they think about, and holds people accountable. Many people are doing good work in the government and the communities, but there hasn't really been that all of government effort that I think is necessary. And it also has to be sustained. We know in our inner cities, poverty, economic deprivation, educational underattainment, these are really hard, almost passed down intergenerational problems. And so again, I think that there are maybe some lessons from the United States that we can offer. There are other lessons from other parts of the UK, Scotland, and also Limerick in Ireland has done a very good job in addressing this. So it's not an easy solution, and it has to go hand in hand with getting the criminals off the street and prosecuting them and convicting them and then sentencing them for reasonable amounts of time. And this has also been a focus that the sentencing guidelines really need to be looked at, because they seem, I think to most Americans, they would seem very, very lenient. But I defer to my fellow commissioner, Professor.
I agree. Mitchell has covered most of it. It does need a multi-agency and multidisciplinary approach. And as you know, and anyone who's ever worked with government knows that they prefer to work in their own silos at times, tackling the problem from their point of view. And so health doesn't talk to the economic people or the folk that are dealing with education and the folk that are dealing with justice. And that's where our commission comes in recommending what we call a whole of government approach, which is really an integrated approach. And I think that the International Fund for Ireland is a very good example. Though it's not dealing with investment, it is dealing with the disadvantaged areas. And where you feel, as is the case with other conflicts that I work in around the world, where people feel they've been left behind, they don't have aspirations, that they are politically homeless, then they take to the streets because they've nothing to lose. We need to give them some sense that they have a lot to lose, but I don't want it just to be about prisons and police, that they are losing the possibility of getting a good job, of being well trained, well educated. And the point that I make in my statement is we cannot leave this to the police to do this alone.
That's right.
They will not succeed. And we cannot lock up potentially 17,000, which is the number that we have been given, of paramilitaries. This is not a prison problem, although for public interest, those criminals and gangsters and coercive controllers, as I call them, should be locked up. But there are plenty of decent, good people who want a stake in their future. And that's where the United States comes in, as it has done over the past 3 decades.
Well, ma'am, thank you very much, and I appreciate both of you. And quickly, I do have one more question on in the post-Brexit world, and for anybody that wants to add to this. With my remaining 30 seconds, how can the United States help encourage the UK and the EU writ large to prioritize easing those trade tensions that have resulted, in that post-Brexit, from the post-Brexit arrangements?
Do you want to make me try? Well, first of all, they're working on trying to make, obviously, the arrangements much more flexible. on the protocol, and encouraging the EU to be exactly the same, more flexible on the protocol to let goods through and flow more easily. However, if Scotland was in the protocol, those goods would be going through Scotland, and there'd be far fewer checks on the borders. But the second thing I think is not just to focus on trade. I think the EU and US should get together on all these other issues as well. And I want to reiterate exactly what both have said about economic and socio-economic issues. The disadvantaged areas need investment, need support, and working together, the United States and the EU could help do that. Thank you.
Well, it looks as though I'm out of time. I appreciate, again, the witnesses' answers on these important subjects. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield.
Thank you very much, Representative. The chair now recognizes Chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee, Chairman Deutsch, for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for this important hearing. Until the formation of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition in 1996, women were nearly absent from politics in the region. And in conflicts around the world today, we are still seeing underrepresentation of women in conflict prevention and resolution. Discriminatory power structures continue to inhibit women's full participation in peace-building processes and the full implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Given all of that, Professor McWilliams, let me start with you. Why was the inclusion of women in the Good Friday Agreement negotiations critical to its success? And what role do women play in conflict negotiations in Northern Ireland and Europe overall?
Thank you for that question. And I'm delighted that we have got today the UN Security Council resolution on women, peace and security. It came in the year 2000. We existed in the 4 years prior to that, so we didn't have it to back us up. So we had to fight our own way to the table. We had been around for 25 years, despite some of the leaders of the other political parties saying, did these women fall out of the sky? Of course we didn't. We got to the table by getting elected, which showed you the appetite for the civic society people to get women to the table. We were a small party, but we had equal speaking rights and equal input. Had we not been at that table, there would have been no provisions on victims, on integrated education, on shared housing, on the civic forum, and on resources for young people and community development. That's what sustains peace. That's what women do. When women get to the table, they pay attention to the issue of inclusion. They ask, whose voices are not here? Who should we be talking to? Where are the gaps? And then we read these agreements and we say, does that sustain peace? By simply letting people out of prison, by reforming police and criminal justice, exceptionally important, by good governance arrangements and sharing power, incredibly important. Constitutional arrangements, number one, exceptionally important. But sustaining peace, that takes as hard work as the day I signed the table or the agreement at the table. It's taken me another 2 decades to continue to make that, along with all my other colleagues, to make it work. What has that sustained peace? It was about those young people. It was about the questions you've just asked me in relation to economic and social investment. You don't often see those in peace agreements. And that, I think, if I had to go back to the table, and hindsight's a great person to have at the table, I would have worked much harder to ensure that those proposals would have been there. But nonetheless, we've now got an opportunity to do that. And that's what women do. And I am only involved now with women around the world, in Colombia and Middle East, in lots and lots of very tough conflict situations. And I want to give a shout out for the leadership that I've seen that women play at risk to their own lives. And we have a programme called Women in Communities in Transition in Northern Ireland, and they're standing up to the paramilitaries. They're saying, if you want to call me an informer, go right ahead, but I'm going to work with the police in ousting these gangsters. They're not going to control my life. We know what it's like when we're controlled by men who abuse us in our own private lives, and they're not going to get it away with it in their public lives. So it's a combination of that learning and that thinking that women bring to the table. And sometimes they're not there. And as a result, we lose out on sustainable peace.
I appreciate that. I'm going to join you in that shout out to the courage and the insight and the wisdom and the passion brought to the table. I appreciate that very much. Ms. Morrice, same question to you. And then also just to expand, as we work to implement the strategy on women, peace, and security around the world, what lessons can we learn here?
Thank you very, very much for bringing that to me, because first of all, which is in my notes there, I am a member of the Women in International Security, the Brussels branch of that on the advisory committee, and they're doing very, very valuable work, obviously bringing together the top brass women, all too few still, together and talking about these issues. And certainly we are trying to look much, much more into, instead of defense and security, also peace building and conflict resolution, the longer term approach. And that is exactly what Monica has said. You know, there's so many different aspects to this that are not looked at properly by NATO. You know, where's all this money that goes into defense and security? Where's the sort of proportion that is the equivalent for peace building? You know, that's so lacking. I'll give you a quick example. I was in Afghanistan. I was with a DUP member and a Sinn Féin member, and we were talking to rural leaders, if you like. And I tried talking about the role of women in conflict resolution. I couldn't get any sort of reaction at all. So at the break, I asked, it was Jeffrey Donaldson actually from the DUP who was with me as well. And I said to him, look, this is impossible. Will you do my bit and I'll do your bit? And he said yes. So we went back in and he talked about the role of women in the peace negotiations. And really the dynamic changed in the room. They listened to him. And I talked about decommissioning and paramilitary, etc. And you see that important point I'm making? Men need to start pushing this agenda. And that's where it's going to help get somewhere. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing and thank the witnesses. Truly appreciate your participation and insight. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and thank the witnesses. Those were very insightful responses. Chair now recognizes for 5 minutes a member who has great personal experience in all issues Europe, Representative Wagner, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and I associate myself very strongly with the words that Ms. Morrice and McWilliams have just expressed, and I'm grateful that we're having this hearing. I thank our witnesses truly for your tireless work to promote peace in Northern Ireland. I think Congress has been honored to have played a role in this peace process, and I believe this body can continue to serve as a force for prosperity and dialogue and mutual understanding. Ms. McWilliams, what do you believe were the driving factors behind the uptick of violent rioting in Northern Ireland this past March and April? And how concerned are you that violence will flare up again as frustration continues to rise over Brexit implementation and some of the pandemic response efforts?
Well, there was a range of reasons. It wasn't just one reason. And one I've already mentioned was those particularly loyalist communities feeling threatened by their identity. And obviously that has been pushed politically when many of the issues have turned out to be technical issues and not political, though they're read as political. And I do want to emphasize this point, that political leaders need to calm things down at these times, instead of perhaps some occasions where they were seen as standing back. And so those that did speak out, those voices needed to be heard. Young people need to engage with their peers, and their youth workers came in and played a huge role, engaging, walking the streets at night. And they had a great phone system and communication system to break down the rumours and the lies, and working closely with the police. Communication was key. In other areas, we have discovered that it was that some of the paramilitary leaders were encouraging the young people out, where they felt there was double policing. The standards of policing were coming down on them.
And let me follow up on that. Ambassador Reiss, you sit on that independent reporting commission, which is tasked with bringing an end to the paramilitary activity and tackling organized crime in Northern Ireland. how do you assess the threat posed by the paramilitary groups to peace in Northern Ireland, and what more needs to be done to end the paramilitary activity?
Well, I think it's a persistent threat that I believe will outlast any settlement of Brexit. It waxes or wanes depending on what's happening politically. I think on the loyalist paramilitary side, they're disconnected with any political representation, meaningful representation, unlike the Republican side. And I think also there's just a general contextual issue that Protestants generally are fearful that they may be losing the future. And Brexit is a harbinger of that. There's concerns over whether they're being let go and the inattention by London. And so there's a general sense that maybe they don't own the future, that the future belongs to another sectarian group. That's an amorphous, it's hard to quantify, but I think that it's real for a lot of these folks. And so again, there needs to be a lot of things that are done. You have to get the criminal element off the street. You just can't really do much else. And there's a smaller, much smaller than the 17,000 number, maybe 1,000 core members. These aren't paramilitaries. These are criminal groups. They engage in really child abuse when they're going after young people with paramilitary style attacks, which is a euphemism. So there's a lot that needs to be done on the law and order side, certainly. But unless you also follow very closely with economic investment, educational issues, all the integrated approach that Monica just mentioned, it's somebody else will fill that vacuum with the criminal leaders. Yeah. And it's difficult. I mean, look, we don't solve that problems immediately in the United States either.
But I would like to add, could I add another caution here, in that obviously CNN and the world's media pay attention when petrol bombs are being thrown at buses. What we needed to look at, and what the US is good at looking at, were the hotspots of resilience. There were lots and lots of areas where riots could have broke out and did not break out because the investment had been there. The work with the police had been there. The youth workers knew exactly who to talk to on the other side. The sports teams came out and maintained their contact. That needs to go on from now on, because we could be looking at a very hot summer with bonfires, with parades, and our usual summers where everyone else gets, like you do, to look forward to your summer. We start to dread ours at times like this. But the positive note needs to be emphasised, that there has been a lot of good work invested. And as Mitchell says, that there has been a paramilitary control that has gone on for too long. But there are also those who went to prison, who are now known as ex-prisoners, and others who have walked away from all of this and are acting in a role of civic leadership. So we need to continue to talk to them, to talk to young people and say to them, don't do what we did. The future is not good. And that's what's good about what's happening.
Could I come in?
Go right ahead.
Chairman,
briefly.
Please, Ms. Morrice.
Just a very quick one again. We in the area that I live, Down, Bangor, Newton Ards, there have been posters that have been put up on every street corner roundabout, which shows pictures, and I think I sent it to you in my notes, of the EU, Mr. Sheshevich, the Biden, Boris Johnson, and Michael Martin, and these faces, and underneath is written, "Nobody's listening to us." Which one do I pick? You know, this is them shouting, saying, you know, somebody listen, please. And really, Monica said it. You know, we need to find ways that their voices can be heard. Now, of course, in our days, the wonderful David Irvines of the day, who spoke so importantly about for his people, if you like. You know, they're obviously, you know, there are elected representatives. There's the Billy Hutchinsons. There's people like that. But how we get to reach out to them. The Irish president spoke on the radio recently about the need to reach out, you know, and I think there could be a lot more being done by America to that end.
Okay, well, thank you. My time has well expired. I appreciate the
Yes.
chairman's indulgence, and I yield back. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Representative. The chair now recognizes committee member, but also the chair of the Transatlantic Legislative Dialogue, Representative Jim Costa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I've enjoyed the perspective that our 3 witnesses have provided. We've talked about the role of the United States, and I'd like to drill down on that. But to the last speaker, as the chair of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue, we have a lot of dialogue, as you might expect, with the members of the European Parliament. And given where we are today, post-Brexit, I would like better insight in where you think the European Union and the Parliament and the Commission will play in terms of the change that has taken place, and where would you like to see a greater focus on the part of our colleagues with the European Parliament and the Commission?
Shall I?
Go ahead, Jane.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very, very much for that question, because that's exactly the direction I think the United States should be looking, and specifically the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council of Ministers. The Parliament, now their Foreign Affairs Committee, and by the way, I have sent the link to this to Michel Barnier, to Mr. Shevchevich, so that they can see that America is actually talking about these things. And I'm very, very sorry that Europe, the European Union, isn't doing something similar to what you're doing. I'm not aware of this being done in Brussels. So that's the first point. You know, if they could start, they're doing great things, but few people know about it. So a hearing
What
like this,
should be their role?
they should work, you and they should work together to promote reconciliation in Northern Ireland. You should be, first of all, helping to fund things like integrated education and mixed housing and victim support. And secondly, opening up business in America and Europe for investment, because don't forget, in trading arrangements, we're going to have Northern Ireland, as a result of the protocol, is open to both markets. So isn't that the best case?
Does not the EU law also provide supporting a framework for guaranteeing human rights, equality, and non-discrimination provisions of the peace accord? And obviously there are a whole lot of issues embedded in that, from security checkpoints to the other elements of the single market, the custom union, the 300-mile border that has effectively disappeared. How are things at the border these days, would you describe?
Well, certainly the border in Ireland has been non-existent, except for the ping on your mobile phone when you go across, and it's still the same. And that's hopefully the way it will be, and that's thanks to the Good Friday Agreement. And I don't know whether, Monica, you want to come in on the sort of the justice issues with the Good Friday?
Yeah, there's free movement across the border. It would be impossible if there wasn't, because people live in the border towns and they work on the other side. And it was the EU, let us not forget, it was the single European market that opened up the border. In my day, we used to be stopped at the border for hours and searched. And then, of course, the army came in and it had its army towers. And you certainly knew when you were crossing the border. You would hardly know that today. And that was as a result of both the peace agreement and as a result of the European single market. But in relation to the justice issues, people are confused here. We will remain as part of the Council of Europe. And of course, the Council of Europe is where the European Convention on Human Rights comes into play. But the concern is, and I mentioned it, that the UK government is now reviewing that act that was part of the Good Friday Agreement, which is the Human Rights Act, which we proposed should be incorporated into domestic law. And it was, and came into effect in the year 2000. That's the very piece of legislation that's now being reviewed at Westminster, because there are those who do not want those convention rights. They see Europe as having too many rights and regulations that doesn't allow its own government to have freedom, and it has a great belief in this issue of sovereignty, and therefore it should be able to decide on itself what rights. Now, that would be a step back. That would be reverting on what was agreed. And so that's the concern about the review of the Human Rights Act at Westminster and the absence of a Bill of Rights, which would have incorporated the issue of being British, Irish, or both. That is an aspiration, and it was a guarantee in the Good Friday Agreement, but it's never been incorporated into law. And that's why it should be clarified in a Bill of Rights. And so it's those extra rights that aren't in the Convention, that are in the peace agreement, that have been left hanging out there and have never been legislated on. So that's why Brexit has become such a concern.
This is probably one of the most important things that's been overlooked, and I'd like to stress it, and your help would be great in this. Because thanks to the Good Friday Agreement, we are, as Monica says, British, Irish, or both, which means every single citizen in Europe, in Northern Ireland, is entitled to be a European citizen. They don't have to be Irish. They can be British European as well. So we have all the rights already, and we will always keep the rights that every European citizen has. And that is something that isn't talked about nearly enough, because it is such a huge advantage for us here.
So my time has expired, but Chairman Keating, this is probably something that in our future conversations with our colleagues in the European Parliament, we ought to put on as an agenda item in terms of their Foreign Policy Committee and get their take on what their future participation is going to be on this important issue.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you for your leadership on the dialogue. Also, I agree with you. If you could schedule that on, I think given the comments of the need for economic opportunity, cooperation, resources, those kind of joint efforts would be important. So thank you for that suggestion. It'd be great if you followed up and did that. Appreciate your work and your questions. The chair now recognizes Representative Brad Snyder for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, and I want to thank our witnesses for spending the time with us today and sharing your thoughts and perspectives. One of the things that struck me in reading the testimony and then hearing the talk today is, the uncertainty, anxiety about the future. Someone talked about owning the future, I guess, and maybe I'll start with Ms. Morrice. What does it mean looking to the future, trying to find an inclusive future? How do we best do it? And what role might the United States play to best facilitate that?
That is definitely the $1 million question. I think you're going to talk about the future. Exactly. This is the issue of the constitutional status of Northern Ireland in the future is the biggest question that we face here. And actually, while obviously the talk is about, when there will be a referendum on a united Ireland, and that is what is helping to increase concerns among the unionist loyalist community of increasing talk about this, the fact that of a referendum even, and the fact that Brexit has made that debate much more open. I think where I come from on this is seriously to put it into a new context. And I think Scotland holds the key for this, because tomorrow we are going to hear whether or not an overwhelming majority of people of Scotland want independence and vote for the independent parties there. So then they will eventually get an independent referendum. And what happens when or if Scotland leaves? And obviously Scotland wants to join the European Union. So think of Ireland in that context. Think much, much longer term, because whatever happens, it's going to happen in Scotland first. And so if we see a Scotland leading, that takes it out of the whole context of the binary choice, Ireland, United Ireland, Shared Ireland, etc. And think about Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland coming together in a customs union and a single market. Is that not a much healthier approach to everything? It can bring in orange and green. It can bring in our culture, our traditions, and it changes the whole narrative. And I would love if that sort of conversation was much more vocal in our media. Let's get a new narrative. Thank you. Hope that helps.
Well, thank you. And maybe I'll turn next to Ambassador Reiss and your thoughts on the same question.
The question being, what can the United States do to help with the future of Northern Ireland?
To give a faith in the future. I mean, as I was listening, what I was saying is, belief in the future, resistance to criminality. If those are the choices, I want people looking to the future with, as you mentioned earlier, an optimism,
right,
that the future holds bright prospects for them.
I think that the United States, showing that it cares about Northern Ireland, is invested in its future, perhaps personified by a special envoy chosen by the president. I think all of that reassures people about the future. They have confidence still in the United States. Obviously, 40 million plus Irish Americans, all the personal, traditional, cultural ties, economic ties are absolutely essential. So I think it just provides a little bit of a safety net that people fear that they won't be let loose, that the United States will do the right thing, will make sure that it listens carefully to what people want and can be an advocate, not just in Belfast, but also in Dublin and London. So I think that the United States being visibly involved at this point is something that's very important. And I have to confess, after I left the position in 2007, I really thought that it wasn't needed. I thought that the political future could be charted solely by the leadership in Northern Ireland. I was wrong. I think that today that there is a real need for the United States to bring its optimism, but also some ideas about how we can deal with some of the persistent challenges of the North. And I think that that would be welcomed, not just in the North, but also by Dublin and by London.
Great. Thank you. And I apologize, I'm out of time. Professor McMorris, I was going to ask you is what we could do to reinforce those anchors of resiliency, or those, I think you said hotspots of resilience.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. We've been pretty liberal.
It's been a good job so far in terms of the International Fund for Ireland has published its reports. And the Ireland funds also that from the US have invested in youth leadership and in peace leadership and peace builders, and that needs to continue because the programs are often from year to year, and as soon as they start showing some success, they're stood down. So that's really important to look at this on a longer term basis, and sustaining those good projects. So the resilience is building in. That's always very important in terms of peace building, and civic society must be included in that dialogue because it does know much better sometimes than the politicians. They used to say in Northern Ireland, the people who are ahead of the politicians on that one. They might say that sometimes in the United States. I don't know.
I was going to say that may be a shared principle probably across the world.
Yeah. And I would think on this issue of identity, you struggle with it too in the United States. We're not alone in that. German American, Cuban American, Irish American. Jane has added Ulster Scots American. There are multiple identities, and not just the binaries. I mean, as you know, in the Women's Coalition, we were very inclusive in relation to our identities. Some of the women were fed up and no longer wanted to identify with those binaries. And so there's the point. Should we be having more of a discussion involving the United States and Americans who are good at this discussion in relation to cultural identity? The British identity of those who hold it dearly in Northern Ireland somehow now feel really threatened, either because of the potential referendum or because of what they're referring to as the border down the Irish Sea. So it's not just a focus on the economic question, which I wish it was. It's a question of my identity, their identity. And that's why I think if the US have got people who have worked on this very closely, and I've lived in the US myself, I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan, that I saw that being played out, as you're seeing too recently on your streets, in relation to that very issue about identity and your future identity and your stake in the community. And during President Clinton's time, he held a huge conference on economic investment. It might be useful to even think about holding a conference on this issue of cultural identity. And
great point.
Bring those individuals to Northern Ireland.
Well, thank you, Professor. And again, thanks to everyone for your very thoughtful response. And Chairman, thank you for the extra time. I yield back.
Great. Thank you, Representative. Chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the Vice Chair of our committee, Representative Spanberger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our guests who are here today. I really appreciate you joining our subcommittee and bringing just your exceptional experience to inform this conversation. And I do also just want to express my appreciation to Chair Keating and all of our witnesses today who have been framing this conversation that peace is not just something you reach and then becomes a permanent state. It's something that requires continual focus, and it needs to be affirmed and reaffirmed. And so I think in this effort, it's incredibly important for the United States to be supportive and engaged. And so I'm grateful for you spending time with us today. Ms. Morrice, I do want to note that in your opening statement, when you spoke about a Celtic Union, much like the Benelux countries, I thought that was a very interesting comment to make. I have previously lived in one of the Benelux countries, and I think it's a pretty straightforward comparison that may be more broadly understood in terms of what it is that you've been speaking of. And you also spoke, Ms. Morrice, about student exchanges in the Erasmus program. And so I have a variety of other things I wish to talk about, but that one struck me as really a personal, community-focused, person-to-person way of creating and affirming peace. And so, Ms. Morrice, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to your suggestion in that space of student exchanges for those who may be watching this hearing and for my other colleagues participating.
Thank you very much. I certainly will. First of all, to note that the incredibly important move by the Irish government to keep Erasmus operational in Northern Ireland and to fund it from that point of view, while it's been taken away, been replaced by a different system, Turing system in the rest of the UK. That is the number one excellent opportunity. Now, that means that, and by the way, I was an Erasmus student in 1976 in France, but it wasn't Erasmus in the day, it was EU funded. And 30 years later, my son was the same in France as well. So it is a hugely valuable, one of the best tools the European Union has, in fact, to promote interchange, cultural interchange. So normally it means students going and living either anywhere in the European Union for a year, or even they can go abroad, America, Japan, people have done it. So that's a vital way of discovering a new culture, a new country. But my suggestion here, and thank you for picking it up, is that actually Ireland operates, if you like, a mini internal Erasmus and starts offering places for northern students down south for a year and southern students up north for a year. And, you know, and I mean, maybe there will be some Erasmus students who say, no, I want to go to the south of France or somewhere. But honestly, if you think in terms of the island, that would be a very, very healthy way of people of the getting to know you better, which is vital in the north-south scene, I believe. By the way, I had also, before I left Brussels, I was a member of the European Economic and Social Committee, which is the Civic Forum of Europe. And in that, I suggested that the European Parliament propose free transport for pensioners throughout Europe. There's certain countries like Luxembourg already do free transport for pensioners. But to have that Europe-wide, wouldn't that be an exceptional way of letting older folk who desperately need minds open? No, not all, of course. But, you know, what a wonderful way of getting exchange if you had free transport. And I think that would include Northern Ireland too. So there you are, full of ideas, but I love getting the opportunity to put them out there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I find this so fascinating because particularly with students and student exchange, it provides such an opportunity to uncover and understand that sometimes the differences that might create tensions are in fact not nearly as profound as we may have thought. And so to continue on, my next question, I'll direct it again towards you, Ms. Morrice, or towards Professor McWilliams. Focus on engaging underrepresented communities. I know this was really central to the work that you all did with the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And so I'm curious, can you discuss a little bit the importance of this type of engagement for maintaining and strengthening peace? And how do these efforts, in your view and in experience, prevent violence and also simultaneously strengthen democratic institutions?
Do you want to start or shall I, Monica?
Go ahead, Jean.
Well, first of all, by the way, something I left out in my original answer to your question was Cooperation Ireland is doing a lot of work in that. And I always like to give a bit of a shout out to certain people and things that are doing good work in this area. So that's a very valuable one. Now, the question you're saying is underrepresented communities. Well, I suppose I'll talk about women. Because that's the one we certainly have experience of. And, you know, I am a firm believer, if we've got 50-50 where it should be in all levels of decision making and the public and private sector, you know, that does get balance. It's so simple to recognize, and I can't see why it isn't understood. Now, positive discrimination might be a step too far, but even things like gender pay balance, and by the way, here's going to be a very important one in this that I don't think anybody's been properly looking at. There is a huge gender pay gap, right? And you're talking 20% Europe-wide. But now, if there's a gender pay gap right now, what's the female pensioner pay gap going to be like? Now, that is going to feed into pensions, which is going to make pensioners far, far worse off in the future than their male counterparts. And that's something I think needs to... Now, excuse me, I have to declare an interest in that area. but there you are. There's my understanding. It probably wasn't the ones you were necessarily thinking of, but I don't know.
No, but could I respond by saying that we do have very strong legislation in relation to fair employment? And the Good Friday Agreement introduced a particular piece into the legislation known as Section 75, which pays attention to the issue of underrepresentation. There is some controversy over whether or not it's paid sufficient attention in relation to areas that have been disinvested or haven't had sufficient investment, and particularly west of the Ban, which in Northern Ireland terms predominantly Catholic areas are west of the Ban, and they would argue that they're grossly underrepresented in terms of the new jobs and in terms of the issue of equality. So that does raise its head. The other issue for us, like you, is the issue of race. And what Northern Ireland was opening up to prior to Brexit were the European communities. We had a very large Polish community in Northern Ireland. And Portuguese and many others came to work in Northern Ireland. Many of them have now returned because of Brexit. But we have an increasing number of ethnic minorities who resent the fact that we continue to talk about Protestant and Catholic only in terms of underrepresentation. So that is an issue that is also paid attention to now in terms of policing those communities, as you also have recently been confronting that issue in the United States. So the issue of inclusion is key to peacemaking in terms of all of those identities, ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, as well as religion. But our focus, as you can have guessed in terms of this conversation today, has been predominantly on political identity and on religion. The good part of our peace building, and it shows you the sign of peace, that we've become much more inclusive of those other identities.
Thank you very much to the witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the Vice Chairman, and with unanimous consent, we'd like to just have a second round of 3-minute questions, just as follow-ups. I'll go first, just with one question that was mentioned in two of the witnesses' written testimony that I just want to explore more. And that's that the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition was credited with the inclusion of civic forums in the Good Friday Agreement. And, what's the importance of reinstating these forums after they were disbanded shortly after the creation of the Northern Ireland Assembly? Can you touch upon the importance of that and how it could possibly be reinstated?
Yeah, the Civic Forum we put into the Good Friday Agreement because we were very aware that there may be some political instability as the governance arrangements came into place. And that sometimes it's really important to put social, economic and cultural issues into another body to advise the Assembly. Not that it would be totally representative because it wasn't elected, but that it would be able to sit alongside the Assembly in those years. And indeed it did. It was established, but only for a short time because the political parties told me, and if they were saying it to me, they were saying it to other parties, we're now in place here. We don't need a civic forum. Now, that was quite a shocking indictment at a time when we were building peace. Of course, you needed a civic forum and sensible civic dialogue from business leaders, trade unionists, farmers, the victim sector, those who'd been in prison, the youth sector, the gender sector, the children's sector. We had designated all the different types of sectors that would be prepared voluntarily to step forward and give their leadership to the Civic Forum, and indeed they did. And it was stood down. The Assembly collapsed 4 times during my period as an elected member. And each time it did, the Civic Forum got nowhere. And eventually it just disappeared because there wasn't the investment in keeping it going. It seems to me a very easy resource. It's not expensive. People volunteer. And those business leaders and others in civic society, and community leaders in particular, are saying it would be good to hear our voices at this time, particularly now, and with all of the controversy and contestation over the leaving of Europe. So that's why I suggested that it would be really important to reinsert it. And secondly, as Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. And if all politics is local, we should actually have a trickle-down effect to district council levels, where the disturbances are happening are at the local level. And so again, a proposal might be to have district council civic forums where local people, local business leaders and others can come forward and take testimony, as you're doing today, invite experts to give accurate information before these riots break out and before they wait for disturbances to happen before they react. So it's a proactive peace building mechanism. And that's why I proposed it to put in my statement today.
Shall I come in on that?
Ms. Morrice, yes.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. And this is excellent because it is a very important part of the Good Friday. I mean, we're talking here about the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, and the Civic Forum is one of the bits of the Good Friday Agreement that isn't implemented. So it should be back up and running. I, as a member of the European Economic and Social Committee, if you like, that was the Civic Forum of Europe. There were 350 of us from trade unions, business, consumers, farmers, women's groups, youth groups, all sitting together and actually giving our opinions on all pieces of European legislation. And it works very well in that it doesn't have a veto. We wouldn't have a veto, but we feed into the decision-making process. So the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, all receive our opinions on a certain piece of legislation, and they take it on board. And if they want, but they're probably advised to because of the publicity and the support they will get if they take on board the work of the Civic Forum. So that would be exactly how it would work in Northern Ireland. And you see, it takes the politics out of decision making, if you like, in the Civic Forum. So people are working simply on the impact on an economic, social, or cultural level. And that really is desperately needed in Northern Ireland. You know, if you can have farmers arguing with consumers about prices and things like that, it's a much healthier argument. And that's what we should definitely have. And the United States really insisting on the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement with that one would be excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to highlight that. It was in your written testimony, and I thought it was an important way to try and maybe break down some of the division, because some of the division, I think, is more political than maybe exists with the majority of the public. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you. If Vice Chairman Spanberger or Representative Costa have a second round question, I'll recognize them at this time. Vice Chairman Spanberger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for allowing us a second round with your time. So my question's about U.S. engagement, and notably one of the steps that the Biden administration may consider is the appointment of a U.S. special envoy for Northern Ireland. Ambassador Reiss, I'll direct this question to you. What do you think President Biden should keep in mind as he considers whether to appoint an envoy, and if so, how to select the appropriate person?
Well, I think that the president needs to confer with Secretary of State Blinken and choose somebody who has the time, the energy, and the passion to commit to this issue. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be a third or fourth job. And I think somebody who is going to have an open mind, somebody who's going to be seen as an honest broker by all the parties, especially across the sectarian divide in the North, and somebody who will have access to the Secretary of State and to the President as needed. It's tempting, of course, to present it to a political donor, and there may be some that actually fit those qualifications. But I think that given where Northern Ireland is now, what the challenges are, and the potential positive role the United States can perform, I think it would be well advised to give it to somebody who understands the issues, the key players, and has a positive sense of what the United States can achieve.
Thank you. I'm smiling because I think that so many of the comments, particularly about the focus, the experience, the recognition of and the knowledge of who the key players are, is important. And certainly, I think those who've spent a career in the Foreign Service or in the service to our diplomatic priorities have a particular experience that's valued. Professor McWilliams and Ms. Morrice, in my remaining moments, I'm curious if you would have any thoughts about, if there were a special envoy, how that individual could support or complement the local efforts to reaffirm peace and build tolerance and prosperity ultimately.
Well, I think it's crucial at this time. And that person then has the ear of both the Congress and indeed if it was the President's envoy likewise. And it would build confidence, I think, in us ourselves back here, that we had that conduit. I want to pay tribute here to the US Consul in Belfast and to the consulars that we've had over the years who have been first class. And I know them all, and they have done such a great job in terms of the service they have given us. I think the envoy, but that person, as you know, comes and goes. And what we need now is the continuity. We have missed having an envoy for some time now. Perhaps Mitchell was right in that there was a time when we needed to be weaned off convoys. I used to say envoys. I used to say to Senator Mitchell, it was time we're on solids now. And it would be nice to think that one day soon we will be on solids, but we're not there yet. And that's why the US envoy is so important to us.
Could I just say that I think it's actually part of a demonstration of the US commitment to peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. So that is important, but at a practical level, obviously, it opens up more and gets the chains of engagement and communication. Definitely, it would be a very valuable thing, and I unfortunately didn't put it into mine, but I certainly will add my voice to that. But I'd also like to pay tribute to, and now obviously we've talked about the Clintons, the role played by the Clintons both. For women in Northern Ireland and for peace in Northern Ireland, it's hugely important. But I also want to mention Obama and his support for integrated education when he came over here was very, very important. And then I want to come to someone else, Nancy Pelosi. It was excellent that she came here and that we met her and we talked about it and she listened, and finding out more about us is exactly what an envoy would ensure happens. Much more coming and going of these people, which is very good. And lastly, but not least by the way, obviously Biden, and the fact that he's already talking about the Good Friday Agreement at the early stages, and he knows the stuff so well. But can I put in a plug, please? Could we make sure that on his first visit to Ireland, which I'm assuming is going to be very soon, next year, maybe, COVID permitting, but that he comes north of the border, that will be a big, important gesture. And two things. One, that he, like other presidents who've come before, visits an integrated school. That gives a very important message. And secondly, launches this wonderful new musical, On Eagle's Wing, the Ulster Scots tradition. Now, wouldn't will those be wonderful things for President Biden to do when he gets here? And thank him for committing to Good Friday.
Excuse me, I don't want to take away anything from all the Democratic politicians that were cited, but I think in the interest of fairness, that perhaps there were a few Republican presidents and Republican members of Congress and just Republican citizens that actually had something to do with advancing the peace process over the years.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you for reviewing that bit of bipartisanship back in the committee, Mr. Ambassador. And I appreciate the answers from all of our witnesses. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you. And I'll echo the fact that serving with someone like Peter King, former colleague of mine and friend, certainly played an important role as well. Representative Koski, do you have any 3 minutes, if you'd like, for a second round question?
Well, just quickly, I commend my colleague, Congresswoman Svanberger, for asking the question in terms of an envoy. And I think that both Peter King, a list of our Republican colleagues that have taken an active role, as well as our Democratic members. I have absolute faith that President Biden, given all of his past involvement on these issues, is going to choose an envoy that clearly reflects someone who has the skill sets necessary to represent the administration. I think he takes this issue very seriously, as does Speaker Pelosi. Her comments in April last year as it relates to the Good Friday Agreement, I think, are well stated. Just let me quickly ask you, do you think that, getting back to the EU role, that the Commission should appoint such an envoy representing the EU?
Well, by the way, I was that person. The European Commission has offices, representations they're called, in every member state, and in certain of the larger member states, it's not only in the capital, but it's also in the regions. And they had in the UK, there was one in Belfast, Edinburgh, and Cardiff, as well as London. And I was the representative for 7 years in the EC's office in Belfast. And yes, I'm awfully glad you've raised that. There is still someone here, but obviously it's a different role now, because it's no longer a representation. It's more like an embassy or something. So it's different. And you're absolutely right. I think that they should go back to there being back to the representation we had, because that was huge. But when I was in the office in Belfast, that was the first peace program. And by the way, there's one name we haven't mentioned yet, John Hume. You know, the role of John Hume in bringing both America and Europe together. And in those days, this was the early 90s. I was there in 92 to 97. And John Hume was instrumental in bringing about the European Peace Programme, and working with my office. And of course, so yes, we should have reinstated, but there is a slight problem in that there's even a debate or argument or controversy, I don't know what the right word is, about if there is an EC office in Northern Ireland, where it should be situated. Should it be in central Belfast, or should it be at the border? I don't know where they are with that, but certainly.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you,
Your
Representative.
voice was well heard when you had that position. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the subcommittee.
Thank you, Representative. And thank you for bringing the name John Hume forward to be recognized, as well as the colleagues I worked with in my time here, Peter King. I also want to ask unanimous consent. Chairman Richie Neal is chairing a Ways and Means hearing that occurred simultaneously with this. And he did submit a statement, and I'm asking unanimous consent that be placed on the record, the official record for this hearing. And I want to recognize him and thank him for all his work as well. Just a couple of closing comments that are important. Number one, I've noticed both Professor McWilliams and Ms. Morrice are wearing the colors of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. And so that did not go unnoticed, and I want to thank you. It's a symbol of your continued commitment to that cause. Ambassador, thank you for your comments. This was a terrific, we couldn't ask for a better panel to discuss these issues. And your insight is incredibly important. All three of you, thank you for doing that. I think I made it clear, that even as a person with Irish heritage, my grandparents immigrated from Ireland to the US. I'm speaking as an American, however, when I want to just point to the fact there's great pride in what the US had accomplished here. It goes unsaid. Even when we go to other parts of the world, other leaders in conflict will bring this up as a symbol that when hope seems hopeless, that the real challenge of peace can be met. And they point to the Good Friday Agreement all the time, all over the world, as an example of what can be overcome. And it gives me enormous pride as an American that we're part of that, and we were part of that, and we should be part of it until all the commitment is met going forward to that agreement. Brexit has caused its difficulties as we anticipated, but I hope that the protocol is adhered to and we can move forward with this. There's some excellent suggestions by our witnesses today how to do that. And also a reinforcement that even prior to Brexit, there was unfinished work to be done. And we could see some of the cracks in the agreement coming forth. And we have to make sure that not only this is a commitment into an agreement that was important for peace with Northern Ireland, with UK, with Ireland, with all of Europe, but the US as a principal member of this as well, for work that's undone. So it remains a priority with me. It remains a priority, a bipartisan priority, with this committee and the full committee as well as Congress. This is a unifying issue for Congress on both sides of the aisle. And I'll just finish with one of your suggestions, as I took to heart. I will be circulating a letter among colleagues if they choose to join me, formally asking the president to appoint a special envoy to Northern Ireland and take the information we had from you to heart and bring it forward. So thank you again. This was just a terrific panel, a very important hearing, and one that I think we'll have a lot of follow-up on. With that, I will have to do a little homework and say members of the committee will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length and limitation of the rules. And with that, I move that this hearing be adjourned, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and
Thank you,
thank
Mr.
members
Chairman.
of your permanent staff.